The death room was silent, thick as steel. Inside a dim wooden barrack on the edge of Sugamo Prison, the captured Japanese generals sat motionless, hands tied, faces like carved stone. The war had ended weeks ago, yet for them, time had not moved an inch. A single clock ticked against the wall, its sound the only proof that life continued beyond these four walls. One of them, General Kenji Doihara, once feared across Asia, leaned his head against the cold plank wall. His uniform, still neat, clung to a body that no longer obeyed him. He pressed his finger against the dusty floor and began to trace invisible letters his will, written not in ink, but in air. For there was no paper, no pen, and perhaps no need. Death is the last mercy granted to those who fail, he murmured, his voice trembling like wind in an empty shrine. Outside, dawn prepared to rise over a broken Tokyo, the scent of burned rice fields mixed with the iron tang of smoke. Across the Pacific, American victory parades filled the streets of San Francisco and New York, but here, among the defeated, there were no parades, no drums, only the weight of waiting for the gunshots that would end shame. A guard slid open the small peephole. Eyes met eyes, one full of pride turned hollow, the other unsure of what mercy meant. The generals had been told little. Rumors swirled among them like ghosts that executions would begin at sunrise, that the Americans had lists, that they would be lined up in the yard like cattle. And yet, no one spoke. Even the cough of an old colonel was met with silence. The air itself seemed afraid to move. It was the silence not of peace, but of men who had already accepted their deaths. The night grew colder. From a distant corridor came the faint echo of boots, American boots steady, rhythmic, unhurried. They would come soon. The men straightened their backs, not in courage, but in habit. The residue of discipline that even despair could not erase. As the last seconds before dawn faded into a pale blur, General Doihara whispered to no one, "Perhaps they will shoot us cleanly. Perhaps they will let us die as soldiers." But the gunfire never came. Only the clock continued to tick, its second hand slicing through the air like an unseen blade. The room stayed heavy. Still, suspended in that moment between life and death, a place where honor meant nothing. And silence was the only prayer left. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Honor was once sharper than any sword, but now it lay useless before the slow rot of wounds and the stench of infection. In the far corner of the barrack, General Masaharu Homa sat half reclined, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly on his blood-stained tunic. The wound across his abdomen had reopened, the stitches torn by fever and coughing. Flies circled in the humid air, drawn by the scent of sweat and decay. He had commanded tens of thousands across Luzon, believed himself invincible. Yet now, he could not stand. When the pain grew unbearable, he reached for the dagger hidden beneath the straw mat, his last possession of command. The steel glinted faintly in the weak morning light that leaked through the cracks of the wooden wall. "Let my blood cleanse the shame of defeat," he whispered, steadying his breath. Outside, boots crunched over gravel. American soldiers approached. The faint clang of metal trays and muffled orders broke the silence. Hama pressed the blade against his belly, ready to finish what he saw as his duty seppuku, the final act of a warrior who had failed. But before the blade could move, a shadow blocked the light at the door. "Hold it right there," a voice called out firm. Young, foreign. 3 American soldiers entered, not with rifles raised, but with canvas bags slung over their shoulders. One carried a box of medical instruments. Another held bottles of disinfectant. The scent sharp and alien in the stale air. For a moment, no one moved. The generals stared as if seeing ghosts. One prisoner spat on the ground, believing mockery was better than humiliation. But the Americans did not react. Instead, one of them, a lieutenant with tired eyes, set down his case, knelt beside Homa, and carefully took away the dagger. "We're not here to kill you, sir," said a quiet voice behind him. It was a young nurse, no older than 20. "We're here to heal you." The room froze. The words hung heavy, unbelievable. Healing for the defeated. For men who had signed death orders. The generals exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with a strange, reluctant curiosity. Hama turned his head away, unable to look at them. His pride burned more than his wound. But the nurse's gloved hands did not hesitate. She cleaned the infection. Whispering instructions to the medic beside her, the antiseptic stung like fire. Hama clenched his teeth, but said nothing. Outside the barrack, the American flag fluttered gently against a sky still dark with smoke. The empire that had once declared itself divine now lay beneath it, breathing through the mercy of its conquerors. In that instant, something began to shift, not yet redemption, but the first crack in the armor of absolute faith. The dagger, once a symbol of purity in death, now lay dull beside a tray of bandages, and the sound that filled the room was no longer the tick of a clock, but the faint rhythm of life returning where death had been prepared. The wooden door creaked open again the following morning. This time, no one flinched, though every heart braced for the report of rifles. Yet once more, it was not an execution squad that entered, but the same American medic team, carrying trays of gauze, iodine, and soup. The smell of broth drifted through the barrack, a scent so ordinary, so human. It unsettled the generals more than any interrogation could have. General Kenji Doihara, still pale from fever, turned toward the sound of footsteps. "Is this punishment?" he muttered in Japanese. "Too weak to stand." The interpreter beside the medic hesitated before answering softly. "No, General. This is care." The Americans set up a temporary clinic inside the compound, their white tents fluttering in the humid wind. The Red Cross emblem, hastily painted, gleamed faintly under the overcast sky. Over 70 officers and soldiers were treated that week, according to official records. The prison medical ward in Sugamo consumed nearly 600 pounds of medical supplies in its first month: bandages, morphine, quinine, sulfa powder, in a city where civilians still searched ruins for rice husks. Such care for prisoners felt surreal. One of the younger officers, Colonel Shigenori Kuroda, refused to eat for 3 days, convinced the food was poisoned. The Americans noted it in their report. Prisoner exhibits paranoia, refuses rations, assumes deception. But on the 4th day, hunger won over suspicion. He took 1 sip of soup and froze. It was warm, not rationed sludge, but real broth with a hint of meat and onion. "Even at the front," he whispered, "we never ate like this." A nurse approached him later with penicillin, a drug most Japanese doctors had only heard of through rumors. She explained it slowly, almost apologetically. Through an interpreter, "It kills infection." "Sir, it will help you heal." Kuroda stared at her gloved hands, then at the syringe, and for a brief second, he laughed, not in humor, but disbelief. "My enemy," he said, "teaching me how to live." Outside, the sound of typewriters clattered from the American administrative office. Reports, signatures, and medical logs, bureaucracy running parallel to the slow rebirth of men who had expected only death. A stray cat wandered between the tents, earning scraps from guards. One sergeant, homesick for Kansas, joked that even the cat was getting better treatment than most civilians in Tokyo. That evening, under flickering lanterns, an American doctor named Captain Thomas McGrath wrote in his diary, "The Japanese officers are beginning to speak. Not much, a few words of thanks, mostly silence. But it's not hatred anymore. It's confusion. They can't reconcile mercy with defeat." Inside the barrack, Hama lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. He could still feel the warmth of the nurse's hands through his bandages. The war had taught him to despise weakness, to kill pity. Yet now, surrounded by the quiet hum of medical care, he began to wonder which of the two, strength or compassion, had truly won the war. The lanterns dimmed. Outside, an American played a harmonica, softly a tune of home that drifted into the night, reaching ears that had once refused to listen. It was late afternoon when the boundaries between victor and vanquished began to blur. Inside the small ward of Sugamo, General Hama lay on a cot. His arm extended as a young American medic inserted a needle with trembling care. The man's name was Private First Class David Miller, just 19, from Wisconsin. His hands shook slightly as he prepared the injection, not from fear of the prisoner, but from the weight of what this moment meant. The needle hovered above the skin of a man once called the Tiger of Bataan. The silence between them carried decades of propaganda and oceans of hatred. Hama turned his head, watching the boy's face. then asked in hoarse English, "You are afraid of me?" Miller paused, swallowed hard, and replied, "No, sir. I'm afraid I might hurt you." The interpreter didn't need to translate. The tone said, "Enough." The general blinked. His breath caught between disbelief and something unfamiliar. Compassion returned. The needle entered cleanly. Morphine flowed through veins that had once ordered thousands to die, for the first time in years. Hama felt pain recede not from courage or ritual, but from the mercy of another human being. Captain McGrath, standing nearby, wrote later in his report. The general thanked the medic by bowing his head, a small gesture, but it silenced everyone in the room. That day, 23 prisoners were treated for wounds, 12 for malnutrition, 4 for frostbite. The Americans recorded each case meticulously, even listing the prisoner's pulse and blood pressure, in the chaos of occupation. The statistics seemed absurdly precise, yet they became evidence of a strange, fragile order rising from ruin. Outside the camp fence, Tokyo still smoldered. Children scavenged for cans, civilians traded kimono for rice. Every morning, trucks carried supplies through streets lined with rubble, delivering both food and penicillin, the two new symbols of peace. An American sergeant joked, "We used to drop bombs. Now we drop soup." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. One afternoon, while McGrath was cleaning instruments, he overheard 2 Japanese officers arguing softly. One hissed, "Don't speak to them. We are soldiers." The other replied, "Then why are we alive?" The first fell silent. The question hung in the air, heavier than gunpowder. By evening, the atmosphere in the ward had changed. Guards began greeting the prisoners. The nurses no longer avoided eye contact. Humanity, once forbidden in uniform, was quietly leaking through the cracks of discipline. Hama asked the interpreter for paper. On a small torn page, he wrote a single line, "The sword has no answer to the hand that heals." He folded it and kept it under his pillow, not as confession, but as record. As night fell, the ward glowed faintly under electric lamps powered by a generator humming outside. The steady rhythm of that machine became their new heartbeat, mechanical, impartial, alive. Somewhere beyond the fence, the harmonica played again. The melody drifted over the camp like forgiveness neither side could yet speak aloud. Night deepened across Tokyo, the air thick with rain and the faint hum of generators. Inside the ward, the once formidable generals lay in uneasy sleep. Their dreams tangled between the battlefield and the sterile scent of antiseptic. For the first time, no one stood watch for executions. Death had been delayed, replaced by an even heavier burden, survival granted by one's enemy. General Hama turned toward the wall, the bandages on his abdomen stiffening as they dried. He could still feel the warmth of the morphine, the trembling touch of the young American who had feared only to cause pain. In the dim light, he whispered to himself, "What is honor?" Now no one answered. Outside, a stray dog barked at the moon. The next morning, rain drummed against the tin roof. A nurse brought water and aspirin to the prisoners. One of the officers refused, muttering that he would not drink from the hand of his conqueror. The nurse only nodded, leaving the cup beside him without a word. Hours later, the same man reached for it, quietly. When no one was watching, pride had begun to melt, not in defeat, but in hunger for dignity. That day, Hama asked to sit near the window, through the rain-blurred glass. He watched American guards share cigarettes, laughing softly about home. The sound carried something he had not heard in years. He found himself envying it. In the afternoon, a young interpreter entered, holding a confiscated notebook. "General," he said hesitantly, "we found this in your drawer." The pages were filled with his handwriting reflections he did not remember writing during fever. One line read, "I once thought they were demons, but demons do not tremble when they save a man." Hama took the notebook, closed it, and said nothing. His reflection stared back from the steel water basin beside his cot, a man without rank, stripped of medals, living only because mercy refused to let him die. That evening, Captain McGrath visited the ward. He carried a stack of reports but paused at Hama's bed. "Your temperature is stable," he said simply. Hama nodded, then asked through the interpreter, "Why do you care for us?" "We killed your men." McGrath looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Because pain is the same in every language, sir." The general turned his face away, ashamed not by defeat, but by the realization that compassion required more strength than any sword he had ever wielded. To those watching now, if your enemy reached out to save your life, would you accept it? Or would pride make you refuse the very hand that could keep your heart beating? Tell me what you think, and where you're watching from tonight. As the lights dimmed, Hama heard rain tapping against the roof, a rhythm softer than prayer. For the first time since the war began, he did not long for death. Instead, he feared what life would demand of him now that he had been spared. The next dawn broke gently over Sugamo Prison. A thin veil of fog drifted through the barbed wire, turning the watchtowers into ghostly silhouettes. Inside the medical ward, the prisoners awoke not to shouts or orders, but to the quiet scrape of a stool and the clink of a teacup. Nurse Ellen Harding, the same woman who had once tended to their wounds in silence, was now teaching one of the interpreters a new word: forgiveness. Her voice was calm, rhythmic, foreign, yet strangely soothing. General Hama sat on his cot, staring at the mirror-like surface of a metal tray that served as his reflection. The face staring back at him was gaunt, gray, stripped of command, no insignia, no soldiers, no divine mission, only a man who owed his life to those he once called barbarians. He ran a finger over the scar beneath his ribs, then whispered in English, "Alive, but not the same." That morning, the Americans brought film reels into the ward. The projector whirred, and flickering light filled the room. It showed images of American towns, children running through sprinklers, factories turning out food cans instead of bullets, women waving flags at soldiers returning home. For the prisoners, it was like staring through a window into another universe. When the next reel began, the mood changed. The screen filled with Hiroshima ruins, ash, shadows burned into walls. No narrator, only the sound of wind and silence. One of the Japanese officers gasped, another looked away. Even the Americans watching seemed uneasy. The nurse whispered, "This is what war does to everyone." After the film, Hama asked softly, "Why show us this?" Captain McGrath replied, "Because truth heals what medicine can't." The words hung in the air like incense in a ruined temple. Later that day, a classroom was set up in one of the empty barracks, a blackboard, chalk, and a handful of English books. The lessons weren't just language, they were ethics, democracy, law, for generals who once commanded armies. The idea of learning from their conquerors felt humiliating at first, yet as days passed, curiosity crept in. They began asking questions, hesitant but sincere. Hama, who once delivered lectures on the divine right of the emperor, now listened silently as a young American teacher explained the phrase, "All men are created equal." The irony was unbearable. He scribbled the words into his notebook, underlining them twice, as if trying to convince himself they were real. During a break, one of the guards offered him a cigarette. Hama accepted. They smoked in silence. Two soldiers on opposite sides of a forgotten war. To you watching this now, if you were in that room, seeing your enemies treat you not as a monster, but as a man, could you bear the weight of that mercy? Could you let it change you? As the sun set, Hama's reflection in the metal tray grew softer, blurred by twilight. For the first time, he did not see a general, or a failure, or a captive. He saw simply a man forgiven enough to start again. Years later, long after the trials, after the final sentences had been read and the world had moved on to other wars. An old man sat in a quiet room overlooking the Kanda River. His name was Masaharu Hama. His once straight back now curved like a weary bow, his hands spotted with age. The world outside buzzed with the hum of New Japan trains, neon lights, factory whistles. But inside his small home, only the whisper of memory remained. On his desk lay a single object, a glass vial, empty but clean. The kind once used to hold morphine. He had kept it for decades, hidden from his family. Some thought it was a relic of shame. But for him, it was the last symbol of something he could never fully name mercy. In his final years, Hama wrote his memoirs by hand, line by careful line. His writing was steady, precise, almost like a soldier's march, but his words carried the softness of repentance. "I lived," he wrote, "because my enemies believed in the value of life, even for those who had taken it away. They defeated us not by cruelty, but by restraint, not by the sword, but by the quiet courage to care. He recalled the trembling hand of the young medic, the warmth of the nurse's touch, the scent of broth in the cold barrack. In that moment, he wrote, "I saw what our empire had forgotten, that compassion is the sharpest weapon." One winter morning, an old comrade visited him. They spoke of the past, of lost divisions, of soldiers buried in foreign soil. When the visitor rose to leave, he asked softly, "Do you still think they were our enemies?" Hama looked out the window, where a child was feeding pigeons on the street below. "No," he said, "they were the mirror we refused to see ourselves in." He did not live to see the next spring, when his belongings were sorted. The nurses at the veterans' home found a sealed envelope marked simply, "For the young man from Wisconsin." Inside was a letter, yellowed but unbroken. "You feared hurting me that day," it read, "but your trembling hand gave me back my humanity. I hope you lived a long, peaceful life." Beside the letter was the old syringe needle, polished from years of careful keeping. Under the morning light, it glinted faintly, not as a tool of pain, but as a fragment of grace. The last line of his diary read, "Honor does not die in surrender. It is reborn in kindness." And so, in a world rebuilt from ash, the story of a general who expected a bullet but received a bandage instead became something larger, a lesson whispered across generations. Because history remembers victories, but humanity survives through mercy. History often measures wars by their battles, their weapons, their casualties, but it forgets the small, quiet acts that shape what comes after. When the guns fell silent in 1945, millions believed the story of mercy had ended. Yet in the corners of ruined prisons, in the trembling hands of soldiers too young to understand vengeance, a different history was being written, one without fanfare or flags. The story of the Japanese generals at Sugamo is not about surrender. It is about rediscovery. They entered their cells prepared to die, convinced that the enemy's justice would be swift and merciless. Instead, they encountered something far more devastating: compassion. It disarmed them more deeply than defeat ever could. In the sterile glow of an American medical tent, the idea of humanity, long buried under layers of obedience and ideology, began to stir again. What the Americans gave was not forgiveness, but choice. They offered life, and in doing so, forced their captives to face a truth their empire had denied: that strength is not measured by the power to destroy, but by the will to heal. For men who had built their faith on the sword, the touch of a nurse's hand became unbearable proof of their own blindness. Years later, when survivors of Sugamo were asked about their captors, many spoke not of humiliation, but of confusion, that peculiar ache of being saved by those they were taught to hate. And perhaps that confusion is the beginning of wisdom. Somewhere in a quiet archive, the records remain: lists of medicines, body temperatures, supply logs, signed by men once sworn to kill each other. The paper has yellowed, the ink faded, but the meaning endures, the miracle of restraint in a world gone mad. If you listen closely to that story, beneath the noise of parades and politics, you can still hear it, the steady heartbeat of mercy that kept history from hardening completely into stone. In the end, the general's words remain the truest epitaph for every war: that honor is not found in death, but in the courage to see one's enemy as human.